Hi, this is Ed Massiana, and welcome to my version of what I call unique wines. Now, everybody has their own list. This is mine. The background behind me is the vineyard Chambertin in Burgundy, France. Now, why did I choose that versus other Burgundy vineyards that are of equal merit? Because I like the story. You see, Chambertin basically means the field of Bertin. Back in the 12th century, now that's a few years ago, I wasn't there, no matter what you think. The church owned everything. Okay, they owned all of the vineyards, they owned everything. Now, there was a man named Bertin who was a vineyardist. He planted the grapes on this piece of land. And the church let him make the wine. Now, as a reward for doing that, he got to keep some of the wine. And he sold it in order to live and make money for his family. It became so famous that other vineyards around there wanted to take the name. So they did. So there are now 9 different vineyards around Chambertin with Chambertin's name. There's the Trissière Chambertin, Griot Chambertin, Chambertin Clos de Bez, Charme Chambertin, and Chambertin, and Chambertin, whatever. Now, fast forward about 600 years, and we get to the time of Napoleon. Napoleon was so enamored of the wines from this vineyard, from Chambertin, which literally means the field of Bertin, that he would have his troops pass by the vineyard and salute on their way to battle. And it is said that before each battle, he always had a glass of Chambertin, except one. And you know what battle that was, don't you? Yeah, it was Waterloo. Whether that story is true or not, I don't know, but let's face it, it's a great story. My next unique wine are the wines of Mount Etna, which is in eastern Sicily. They are actually grown on the surface of an active volcano. Now, why is that so special? Well, because the fact is that volcano has erupted at times and it can destroy all of the vines. But what's unique about this is the soil, that real honest to goodness volcanic soil. And there's plenty of it around the vineyard. You could barely walk on it because of all the rocks and all of the pieces of lava that have hardened. But that, for some reason, makes some of the best land to grow grapes in. Now, I can't even remember the names of these grapes. Mascarello is one of the reds. There's a few whites. They don't grow anywhere else except on Mount Etna. And they are very, very unique. They have a tightness and a tartness that can be a little brittle and a little tough to get used to. But once you do, these are really exciting and wonderful wines. Are they all created the same? No, of course not. You got a bunch of growers that make their wine, and they're not all the same. But it's a very unique area. It's a very unique soil, and no other wines taste like this grown anywhere in the world. Now, one thing that I find absolutely fascinating is that the EU, the European Union, has a section in their bylaws that makes all of members donate a certain amount of money to a fund for the growers of Mount Etna. Just in case Mount Etna erupts and destroys them, that fund will go to pay for their vineyards. I don't know of any other area in the world where an entity outside of the people growing the grapes actually do something like that, but I think it's really cool. Hi, we're back with ice wine. What is ice wine? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's wine made from frozen grapes. The picture behind me is not Photoshopped. Those are grapes that are on land that have snow on it, and the weather is probably 15 or 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, why is that so special? Well, because most grapes are 80% water, 85% water, mostly water, all right? Flavored water, but water. What happens when you freeze water? Well, it turns into ice. And when the exact right conditions are met, which are that it's frozen, but during the day there's sunlight, even though it's 15 or 18 degrees, that sunlight creates photosynthesis. And photosynthesis keeps those grapes alive. Even though they have to wait until the next morning at night to get some more sun, as long as that happens every single day, those grapes are still alive. And you know what they're doing? They're building sugar and they're building extract in those grapes. And that is really important. When the time is right, sometimes that time could be Christmas. Sometimes it could be in January. I once asked, if you pick a wine in January, what's the vintage date? Well, I found out that the vintage date is when the grapes matured, not when you pick them, but that has happened before. Now, in order to have these perfect conditions, you have to take a gamble, and people take gambles all the time with ice wine in places like Germany and Austria. The problem is they're successful maybe 3 out of 10 times, so the other times they're history, and it doesn't work. And that's a shame, but it is what it is. They're very, very expensive. They're $150 to $200 for a half bottle. And the Canadians who have this happen every year in the Okanagan Valley can produce them for a lot less, and they're equally as good in some cases. Absolutely phenomenal wine. Why are they so good? Well, you know that 80% water grape? They take them to the winery very quickly and they crush them very quickly. And you know what comes out? Ice crystals. And you know what they do with those ice crystals? They throw them away. And then they reserve the rest of those grapes, of which are about a third of the total amount of grape, and they crush that. And that's what the wine is made from. It's like taking 3 bottles of wine and stuffing it into one. That's why these flavors are so explosive and so exciting. Do yourself a favor, buy a bottle of ice wine, get one of those really good Canadian ones. You don't have to spend $1 million to go get one from Germany, although they are spectacular, and try it. And I guarantee you, you'll agree, it's one of the most exciting wines in the world. Now we're going to talk about some individual wines. The first one is Chateau Moussard. Now, what makes Chateau Moussard unique? Well, first of all, it is grown in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. The Bekaa Valley has been growing grapes and making wine for over 4,000 years. Now, in 1930, a man named Gaston Hochar, who had been working in Bordeaux, came back to his homeland at the Bekaa Valley and decided to plant grapes. He planted Cabernet Sauvignon, which of course is a big deal grape in Bordeaux, but he also decided, and we're not quite sure why, to plant Carignan and Cinsault, which are grapes found in the Rhone. So he blended these grapes together to make something like a mixture between Bordeaux and the Rhone. And you know something? It came out fabulous. Absolutely incredible. Those wines have been made for 90 years, and for 90 years, they have been spectacular. I have the great pleasure of tasting wines with his son, Serge, and every wine, every single wine I have ever tasted from Chateau Moussard has been spectacular. Even the ones that were 40 and 50 years old. They sometimes don't even release them until they're 10 years old. And how much do they cost? 75, 80 bucks. Next time you want to splurge and you find an enlightened retailer that carries Chateau Moussard, buy it. It is truly one of the great wines of the world, and certainly, given its parentage, one of the most unique. Now we turn our heads to the island of Madeira, which in the framework of unique wines truly is one of the most unique wines. And the story is also unique. Madeira is on the north coast of Africa. It's owned by the Portuguese. And how it became owned by the Portuguese is a fascinating story. Apparently, a Spanish nobleman decided to marry outside of his nobility, and he was banned from Spain. So he took his bride and his entourage and decided to head to the New World. The problem with doing that, and this happened a lot, and it happened more frequently as time went on, the trade winds from Europe forced you to go south before you could go west, and you ended up smack dab on the island of Madeira. At the time that they landed there, there was nobody on the island, not one single person. However, the forests were so thick that they couldn't even get to one side of the island, but it was so beautiful they decided to stay there anyway. Unfortunately, they got sick and the couple died, so their benefactors, the people that were guarding them, said, well, we're done here, we're going back to Spain. On the trip back, they were captured by Portuguese pirates. And in order to get them to not kill them, they told the Portuguese pirates, look, we're going to show you this really fabulous island that you're going to love. It's amazing. Nobody lives there, and you can have it. So they bought it, and they went over there, and they looked around, and they went, this is nothing but trees. My God, we can't get through the forest. So you know what they did in their infinite wisdom? They burned them. They burned the entire island. For 7 years, those fires raged through the island of Madeira. And what it did was it deposited ash all over the place. I mean, 7 years of ash, figure that one out. That's going to be a lot of ash. Now, when it was all over, many, many years later, the indigenous grapes that were still rooted down at the bottom started to come up. And apparently they just loved that ash. So a small wine industry started on the island of Madeira. And when the ships would go there from Europe, because no matter how hard you tried, unless you had a motor, and they didn't have motors back then, the ships would dock in Madeira. Now, the wine that they tasted that was made there was so bad, it was so acidic and so difficult to drink that they put it in barrels and they used it as ballast on the ships. So there was a problem. It wasn't a problem. They saved money that way. Now, at this point in time, America had been discovered, and there were a lot of ships going to the New World. They wanted to explore the New World. And so there was a lot of wine that was needed for ballast on those ships. But a really crazy thing happened. Wine was terrible in those barrels, and they put them on the ship, and 3 to 4 months later, don't forget, we're not talking about, ships of today. They got there and somebody said, let's taste it. And, the wine was delicious. They said, this wine's really good. Now, one thing that's very important to understand is that they did add brandy to the Madeira wine before its trip to the New World. They did that because at this point in time, they knew that adding brandy would make the wine last longer. They didn't know why, but they knew that it worked, and that's all that really mattered. What it actually did is raise the alcohol level so that oxidation takes place very, very slowly, nowhere near as quickly as it would normally. And it worked, and that's all that mattered. So on its way, it went to the New World. Well, by that time, we were settling the United States. Our forefathers thought that Madeira was the coolest wine in the world, especially our first wine connoisseur, Thomas Jefferson. Now, we don't know if it was Thomas Jefferson or somebody else, but we knew that that trip made the wine better, okay? Even though it cooked on the high seas where it could be 110 degrees sometimes. They figured out that maybe if one trip was good, then 2 trips would be even better. So they went to the New World, and then they came back. And sure enough, the wine was better. So then they started selling these wines based on how many trips back and forth it took to the New World from Madeira and to Madeira. And it totally got out of hand. But by that time, the New World was going crazy over Madeira. We were having Madeira parties, et cetera, et cetera. And then little by little, we went to the Revolutionary War, and then all trade stopped, and then they had to start selling it to everybody else. Now, there are 4 basic grapes that go into the best Madeira. There are a lot of grapes grown there, but they don't make the best wine. They are Cercial, which is relatively dry, Verdelo, which is also a little less dry, and then Boal and Malmsey, which are the sweet wines, Boal being semi-sweet and Malmsey being very sweet. With the lack of ships going to the United States, they didn't have a lot of ships to put ballast on and make Madeira. So you know what they did? They built estufas, which in Portuguese means stoves. So they made this wine and they put them in these stoves, and they put them up to about 120 and 130 degrees for 4 to 6 months. And you know what happened? They got the exact same results. And that today is how Madeira is made. Madeira, by the way, in Portuguese means woods, and for good reason. So we thank those guys that set it on fire, and we thank the guys that figured out that it was better going to America than it was when it was in the island of Madeira, because quite honestly, it's one of my favorite wines in the entire world. Our last wine is definitely one of the most unique wines in the entire world. And it comes from one producer in Sauternes, which is in Bordeaux, called Chateau Yquem. And it is, without question, the most expensive wine to make in the entire world. Why? Because they have a lot of vineyards. They have almost 300 acres of vineyards, and they have dense planting of those vineyards. It's Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon. However, they are blessed or cursed, depending on your outlook, by something that happens almost every year in that vineyard, and that is botrytis. Botrytis is known as the noble rot. It's a fungus, but it's not like any other fungus, which can leave really nasty flavors in the wine. It's a very beneficial mold. It's not a moldy taste. Instead, it gives you flavors of apricot, pineapple, coconut, all kinds of flavors that are truly hard to even imagine in your mouth, but they are otherworldly. Now, as you can see from the picture behind me, as the wine gets older and older and older, it gets darker and darker and darker until it actually is almost black. And no matter how old it is, it's still out of this world. I have had Chateau Yquems that were over 100 years old, and they were singing. You can't kill it. First of all, it's relatively sweet, okay? And so it's a dessert wine. Now, why is it so expensive? Well, let me give you an example. If you have a very fine vineyard, like the Chambertin vineyard, you've got grapes in Chambertin, you are going to keep those yields down very, very small, because you only want a few grapes to grow on that vine so it will get the maximum nutrients that that vine can produce. And that usually means that one vine will give you 5, maybe 6 bottles, okay? Now, Chateau Yquem, when that mold hits the grapes, it shrivels it up so that the amount of moisture in that grapes dries up by a considerable amount. On top of that, they go through the vineyards an average of 7 times and only pick the grapes that are the ripest. They only pick the clusters that have the most amount of ripe grapes on them. So that could take a month to finish the harvest. Do you know how many grapes they get off of that one vine? Enough to make 1 glass, not 1 bottle, 1 glass of wine. There's not a lot of Yquem made. And you can imagine the cost involved. As a matter of fact, one thing about Yquem is that they don't make it unless it's great, period, the end. I have had probably 20 vintages of Yquem, and just about every single one of them was on another planet. So there you have it. It is truly a legendary wine. I used to have a ton of Yquem in my cellar because I could buy a bottle for $40 40 years ago, which was not cheap. But then Yquem decided to double the price with their 1982 vintage that they released in 86 or 87, and they priced me out of the Yquem market. Unfortunately, I don't get to buy it anymore. But if you can, I guarantee you, there's nothing like it. There never has been, and there never will be.